In a small town in Ohio, at the very end of a quiet street, stood an old wooden house where a 60-year-old woman named Patricia Miller lived. To the neighbors, she was nothing more than a solitary figure watering her flowers, sipping her morning coffee, or listening to the radio. What they never saw was the weight she carried behind those walls. 30 years of torment over a mistake that could never be undone. Long ago, she walked away from her husband and young son, chasing a love that proved fleeting, and in the end she lost everything. Now, as age and frailty press heavily on her, Pat holds on to one last hope, to see her son's face just once more. Early in the morning, sunlight slanted through the dusty window of a small wooden house. The place seemed out of step with the quiet suburban neighborhood around it, where newly built homes boasted bright green lawns and shiny cars in the driveways. Patricia Pat Miller's roof was faded, the white paint on her walls chipped and peeling, as if time itself had left her behind. She sat alone in the kitchen. On the old wooden table lay a single plate, a cup of black coffee, and 2 slightly burned slices of toast. The coffee was weak, but she drank it slowly, clinging to a habit formed over the years. In the corner, an old radio crackled out a country song from decades past, its static blending with the steady ticking of the clock, filling the room with a heavy stillness. On a shelf near the sink, a row of prescription bottles stood neatly in line: heart medicine, blood pressure pills, sleeping aids. Each one marked the steady decline of age and health. Often, Pat would pause for a moment before opening a cap, as if weighing whether to endure another day or simply let fate decide. Outside the window, cars passed smoothly along the freshly paved street. The laughter of children carried from a neighbor's backyard, mixed with the bark of dogs and the scent of something sweet, baking in another family's kitchen. From time to time, a neighbor walking by would wave, but rarely stop to chat. Pat watched it all in silence, like a spectator on the sidelines of life. She let out a quiet sigh, running her hand across the rough surface of the table. Every morning was the same. Weak coffee, a crackling radio, and an emptiness that never seemed to fade. After breakfast, Pat slowly walked into the living room. On the cabinet beside the sofa, she bent down and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of old papers, lay a yellowed envelope. She drew it out and opened it with the same ritual she had repeated countless times, her trembling hands never quite growing used to the ache it brought. It was the only family photograph she still kept. Michael Miller, her husband, smiling warmly with little 7-year-old Daniel perched on his shoulders. Daniel's bright eyes sparkled, his small hand raised high as if reaching for the whole sky. And there was Pat in the picture, young and radiant, standing beside them with a smile that once seemed as if happiness would last forever. Pat touched her finger gently to her son's face in the photo. That innocent grin cut through her heart like a blade, reviving memories she had tried to bury for decades. She pulled a worn notebook closer, the ballpoint pen with fading ink waiting on the table. Slowly, she wrote a single line. "If I could go back, I would never leave you." The shaky handwriting blurred as a tear fell onto the page. Pat closed the notebook, clutching the photograph tightly to her chest, her heart pounding as if it might break free. Then, with deliberate care, she placed everything back into the drawer, her movements cautious, as though the past might vanish if she handled it too roughly. The room fell into silence, broken only by the faint sound of the radio drifting from the kitchen. Pat sat motionless for a long time, her eyes red and damp, letting the tide of memories wash over her. 30 years ago, the Ohio summer pressed down with heavy heat. Inside the wooden house, Patricia Pat Miller, just past 30, stood at the door with a small suitcase in hand. Her heart pounded, her eyes swollen from tears, yet she forced herself to appear resolute. In the living room, 7-year-old Daniel clung desperately to his father's sleeve. His young face was streaked with tears, his voice cracking as he screamed, "Mommy, don't go. Please don't go." Michael, Pat's husband, held their son tightly. His face was lined with exhaustion from years of construction work, but his eyes burned with fury and helplessness. "Pat, what are you doing? He needs you. This family needs you." Pat turned her gaze away, unable to meet his eyes. In her mind, she could only hear the sweet promises of another man. A man with money, who had sworn to give her a new life, free from struggle. She convinced herself this was the only path to reclaim happiness. Daniel rushed toward the door, wrapping his arms around his mother's legs. His tiny hands trembled, trying to hold her back, his tears soaking the hem of her dress. "Mommy, please." Pat bent down, ready for a moment to lift him into her arms, but stopped. Taking a sharp breath, she gently pried his little fingers loose. The boy collapsed onto the floor, his cries echoing through the house like something breaking apart. She turned away, opened the door, and sunlight blazed in, blurring the image of her family behind her. The door closed with a final thud, cutting off Daniel's sobs and severing the last thread that bound the three of them together. Now, in the old house, Pat sat hunched on the sofa, her hands clutching her head, her shoulders shaking. Tears streamed down as she whispered, her voice raw, "I destroyed my family with my own hands." That evening the kitchen was dim, lit only by the yellow glow of a ceiling lamp. Pat pulled a chair close to the table and opened her old laptop, its keys worn smooth with age. The screen flickered slowly to life, the fan humming with a tired buzz. She let out a soft sigh, her thin hands resting on the keyboard, fumbling like an aging student relearning how to write. She typed into the search bar, "Daniel Miller." Instantly, a long list of results appeared. But Daniel Miller was far too common a name: a young man in a baseball jersey, a musician holding a guitar, an elderly gentleman with silver hair and a kind smile. None of them were her son. Pat exhaled heavily but refused to give up. She clicked into each profile, studying every photo, scanning the small lines beneath. Lives in Texas. Graduated in 2015. Married to Sarah. Each time, her hope rose only to be crushed again. Half an hour passed, her eyes stinging with fatigue, but she pressed on, turning to the next page. "I abandoned him once. I can't give up on him again," she told herself, the thought anchoring her to the search. Finally, after scrolling endlessly through hundreds of names, Pat froze. In the profile picture, a man in a white dress shirt stood in front of an office building. His smile was faint but his gaze steady. Older now, matured, but the features were unmistakable. Daniel. Her son. Pat lifted a trembling hand to the screen, her fingertip brushing against his face through the cold glass. Clicking into the photo album, she found images of Daniel with a young woman, Lauren, his wife, and a little blonde girl with pigtails, Chloe, 6 years old. One picture showed them at a birthday celebration, the three of them gathered around a cake lit with candles. Pat's eyes blurred with tears. She smiled softly even as they rolled down her cheeks. That beautiful, complete family scene struck her like a blade, for she knew with aching clarity she no longer belonged to it. The next afternoon, Pat sat at the worn wooden table, a sheet of paper in front of her covered in scribbled names and addresses. She had spent the entire morning struggling with the White Pages website, typing Daniel Miller again and again. The results stretched from Texas to California, a sea of unfamiliar faces. Then she tried filtering by Columbus, Ohio, the city where she had seen Daniel check in once on Facebook. The list narrowed to just a few, but only one record matched. Daniel Miller, 37 years old. To unlock the number, Pat had to enter her payment information. She hesitated for several minutes, her finger hovering, before finally pressing confirm. Her heart pounded wildly as the digits appeared on the screen, trembling like a door cracking open into the past. With her chest tight, Pat carefully tapped the sequence into her phone. Holding it to her ear, the long, sharp rings cut through her like blades. She swallowed hard, her free hand gripping the edge of the table. Then came a firm, steady male voice on the other end. "Hello? Who's this?" Pat's mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. A long heartbeat passed before she managed to breathe in and force out the words, "Danny, it's Mom." In that instant, the world seemed to freeze. The line fell silent except for the pounding in her chest. Daniel didn't respond right away. Pat could hear his quick, uneven breaths, like he'd just been struck hard in the gut. And then suddenly his voice broke through, cold, cutting, merciless. "Don't call me that. You're not my mother. Not anymore." Those 4 words, "not my mother," twisted straight into Pat's heart. Her lips parted, desperate to plead, "Danny, please." But before she could finish, the call ended. The harsh, empty beeping filled the kitchen, echoing in the hollow room. Pat's trembling hand went slack, the phone slipping and clattering onto the wooden floor. She collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands. Tears streamed down as sobs tore free from her chest. In the silence of the house, only the sound of her broken crying remained, The sound of a mother losing her son all over again. This time not because she walked away, but because the door to Daniel's heart had been locked against her for 30 years. That afternoon, Pat stopped by the small corner market to pick up some milk and bread. Pushing the rattling cart down the aisle, she bent to grab a box of cereal when a voice called from behind her. "Is that Pat?" Pat looked up, startled. Standing there was a woman about her age, with a fuller figure and neatly tied gray hair. It took a few seconds before recognition struck. Susan Harper, the neighbor who had once lived right next door, more than 30 years ago. "Susan," Pat whispered, her voice unsteady. Susan smiled in surprise, though her eyes carried a flicker of hesitation. "Goodness, I never thought I'd see you again. I just moved back here to live with my daughter. I didn't expect to run into you like this." The two women stood beside the shelves, exchanging a few polite words. But the shadow of the past hung heavy between them. Susan studied Pat for a moment longer, then sighed. "Pat, I still remember the day you left. Daniel screaming for his mom. That poor boy." Pat froze, unable to lift her gaze. After a pause, Susan went on. "Did you ever hear? Michael, he passed away more than 20 years ago. A work accident. Daniel was only 12. He had to figure everything out on his own. I can still see him working odd jobs, trying to keep up with school just to get by. He was strong, yes, but if he'd had his mother there, it would have been different." Pat stood in stunned silence. Each word struck like a blade, cutting deeper into her chest. She gripped the cart handle so tightly her knuckles whitened, fighting to keep her knees from buckling. "No, I didn't know." Her voice cracked, tears already blurring her vision. Susan looked at her, her expression torn between pity and reproach. "I don't say this to condemn you. But Pat, time doesn't give second chances." Pat dropped her gaze, her whole body trembling. The truth echoed in her ears like a tolling bell. Her sin was not only abandoning her son, but also leaving her husband behind to die without her by his side. Pat returned home as dusk settled in. She opened her old laptop, the pale blue glow washing over her weary face. The cursor blinked inside the draft window of an email. To Daniel Miller. She typed a few words. "Danny, it's Mom." I then froze. Her hand trembled, vision blurred by tears. Every letter felt like a blade cutting deeper into her heart. She deleted it all, tried again, then erased it once more. Over and over until the screen was nothing but a blank page. Pat sat there for a long time, staring at the small camera above the screen. The reflection of her lined face and tear-streaked eyes stared back at her. She parted her lips, desperate to speak, yet no sound emerged. The room was silent, except for the faint blink of the cursor, mocking her. 30 years had passed and still, she could not find the words to begin. A week later, with the weight of guilt still pressing heavily on her, Pat stepped into the small front yard to water the wilting chrysanthemums. The sun blazed down on the concrete, the heat thick enough to choke the air. She held the hose, watching the spray shimmer in the light, but her vision was already blurring with fatigue. Her breath grew labored, each inhale dragging a dull ache through her chest until she had to lean against the wall for balance. "Just tired, that's all," she told herself, though her trembling hands made the water scatter across the pavement. Suddenly a sharp, crushing pain seized her chest. The hose slipped from her grip as both hands clutched her ribs. She bent forward, gasping, her vision spinning into a whirl of colors. Staggering a few steps, she collapsed onto the cold concrete, the spray soaking her dress as the hose kept gushing. A dog barked frantically from next door, followed by a neighbor's startled voice. "Pat! Mrs. Pat, what's happening?" Footsteps pounded closer, then a panicked cry for help. Within minutes, the piercing wail of an ambulance tore through the quiet suburban street. At the hospital, harsh fluorescent lights and the sting of disinfectant filled the air. Pat lay pale on the emergency bed, heart monitor beeping in uneasy rhythm. A middle-aged doctor spoke firmly to a nurse before turning to her. "Mrs. Miller, your heart is extremely weak. You've had a severe cardiac ischemia. We need to keep you under close observation. The risk of progressing to end-stage heart failure is very high." The words reached her ears like muffled echoes. All other sounds fractured into silence, leaving only the faltering thud of her heart. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her temples. The first thought that rose was not fear of dying, but the image of Daniel, the son she had not held in her arms once since the day she left. Night fell, but the harsh fluorescent lights in the hospital room still glared overhead. Pat lay on the narrow steel bed, her arms tethered by 4 lines and monitors. The heart machine beeped in steady, monotonous tones, each sound a reminder of how fragile her life had become. From the room next door came the faint sound of muffled sobs. At first it was quiet, then grew into the broken, aching cries of an older woman. Between the weeping came whispered fragments. "No one's coming, I don't have anyone left." Pat turned her face toward the wall, her chest tightening. She listened to every sob that carried through the thin partition, and the darkness inside her grew heavier. A chilling fear crept up her spine. "Will that be me too?" she thought. "Lying here, fading away with no one to know or care?" A vision flashed through her mind. Daniel busy with his young family, not sparing a thought for the mother who had abandoned him. Strangers walking past her casket, faces indifferent, no tears shed out of love. The thought made her eyes flood, tears soaking her pillow. She pressed a trembling hand against her chest, feeling the faint rhythm still struggling inside her. At that moment, the fear of death itself seemed less terrifying than the dread of leaving this world completely alone, without a name called, without a final embrace. Pat closed her eyes and whispered into the darkness, "Danny, I don't want it to end this way." After being discharged from the hospital, Pat returned to her small house, carrying a bag of medications and a sheet covered with medical warnings. The living room was silent, the only sound the heavy ticking of the wall clock. She pulled a chair to the table and set her old laptop in front of her. Taking a deep breath, her trembling hands opened the default camera app. The screen lit up, reflecting a gaunt face, hair thinning and silver, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Pat looked at her own reflection and saw a stranger. For a moment, she wanted to close the laptop. But summoning what little courage she had left, she pressed record. "Danny," her voice was hoarse. "It's Mom. I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I need to say it before it's too late." She paused, breathing hard, then went on. 30 years ago, I walked away from you. I chased after another man, believing he would give me happiness, but I was wrong. He left me after a few months, and from then on I lived a hard, scattered life. But poverty never hurt me the way missing you did." Tears welled up. She wiped them quickly, but her voice only grew more broken. "I remember your 7th birthday. That night I bought a small cake, lit the candles in a rented room, and sang happy birthday to you. Alone. Without you, without anyone. Every year since, I've done it again, as if punishing myself." Her voice faltered. With shaking hands, she reached for the old journal beside her, opening to a random page. She read aloud, her voice trembling. "You are the only thing I think about every single day. No matter where I am, no matter what I do, my heart always belongs to you." Pat froze. Those were words she had written only for herself, never meant to share. She glanced at the camera, startled. She could press stop, delete it, record again. But her body felt drained, her hands heavy. A thought whispered inside her. "I may not have the strength to say this twice, and maybe he needs to see it exactly as it is." She closed the journal, pressing it tightly against her chest, and drew a long, shuddering breath. "Danny," her voice shrank to a pleading whisper, "if you never forgive me, I'll understand. What I did can't be undone. But I'm begging just to see you once before I close my eyes. Just once." Pat reached out with trembling fingers and pressed stop recording. The screen went dark, and the room fell into silence. She sat motionless, her hands covering her face, caught between relief at finally speaking and the agony of knowing those words might never reach Daniel. Pat sat silently before the laptop screen, the cursor blinking in the subject line. Slowly, she typed each word for Daniel. From Mom. Her finger hovered, her heart pounding so hard it felt ready to burst. She reread the line again and again, hesitating each time, then drew in a weary breath and pressed send. A notification popped up. "Your message has been sent." Pat closed the laptop and sat staring into the void. In the faint reflection on the dark screen, she saw a gaunt, unfamiliar face, her own. Lifting a hand to her chest, she felt the frail rhythm of her heart and whispered to herself, "Now it's in fate's hands." The house was silent, except for the relentless ticking of the clock, each strike echoing like a hammer blow. Pat remained motionless, her vision blurring, uncertain whether she had just given herself a chance at forgiveness or planted yet another wound in her son's heart. Across the city, Daniel had just returned home late from work. His shirt still carried the dust of the construction site as he set his briefcase on the table and trudged toward the shower. In the living room, the laptop glowed faintly, the family inbox open. Lauren sat on the sofa, keeping an eye on Chloe playing with her dolls while skimming through emails. Between the clutter of promotions and reminders, one subject line stood out: for Daniel. From Mom. Lauren froze. Her heart tightened as she stared at the words, lips pressed together. Though she had never met her, Lauren knew the heavy shadow that haunted her husband's life, the mother who had walked away when he was a child. After a long pause, she clicked. A video file appeared. She placed her hand on the mouse, drew a breath, and pressed play. The screen lit up. Pat, her face lined with age, eyes brimming with tears. Her voice trembled as she confessed her mistakes, how she left, how the man she followed abandoned her, how she struggled alone through years of hardship, and how on every one of Daniel's birthdays, she lit a candle and sang happy birthday to a boy no longer there. Lauren sat frozen, her chest tightening. Each word pierced like a needle. She covered her mouth, tears streaming. Pat wasn't making excuses. She was only confessing and begging for one chance to see her son again before it was too late. When Pat stumbled into reading an old journal entry, "You are the only thing I think about every single day," Lauren broke down completely. She didn't hear lies. She heard a love twisted with regret, raw and undeniable. Just then, Daniel stepped out, hair damp from the shower, and saw his wife crying in front of the screen. He frowned. "What's going on?" Lauren quickly wiped her cheeks, turning to him. Her eyes, still red, shone with urgency. "You need to watch this." She pushed the laptop toward him. Her hands trembled, but her gaze was steady. She would be the bridge, whether or not Daniel was ready. Daniel moved slowly toward the laptop, the towel still draped loosely over his shoulder. Lauren stayed quiet, only giving a small nod, urging him to sit down. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. The subject line for Daniel, from Mom, still glared from the screen, cutting into the part of his memory he had fought to bury. He pressed play. Pat's face appeared, frail, trembling, her eyes pleading. Within seconds, Daniel's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. When she said, 30 years ago I left you," heat rushed to his head and he shot up, ready to slam the laptop shut. "No, Daniel," Lauren whispered, resting her hand on his shoulder. "Please just listen." He froze, drew in an angry breath, then sat back down. His gaze locked on the screen as though trying to burn through the woman in front of him. Pat spoke of the man who abandoned her, of the years of struggle, of the lonely birthdays when she lit a candle and sang happy birthday to an empty room. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, heavy with scorn. Only one thought screamed in his head. "And where were you when I was at home, crying myself hoarse for you?" But then, as Pat stumbled into reading from her journal, "You are the only thing I think about every single day. No matter where I am or what I do, my heart belongs to you." Something in Daniel cracked. He froze. The fragile figure before the camera didn't look like someone spinning a story. Her tear-stained face, the way she clutched that journal to her chest, it was raw, unguarded, unbearably real. Inside him, rage and sorrow tangled into a knot that threatened to split him apart. He wanted to scream, "No, you're not my mother anymore." Yet his chest grew heavy, because some part of him couldn't deny the truth, that a mother's love, twisted and broken as it was, still existed. Daniel buried his face in his hands. Tears spilled hot and sharp, the kind he had forced back for 30 long years. That night, Daniel lay restless, the glow of the digital clock casting pale light across the ceiling. The room was quiet, filled only with Lauren's steady breathing and Chloe's soft murmurs in sleep. Yet inside his head, memories churned in chaotic waves he couldn't drive away. He saw again the image of a thin little boy in a worn-out coat, trudging through snow to school. Each time he stumbled, he pushed himself up, lips blue, hands numb. He remembered the whispers of classmates. "That kid never has a mom to pick him up." Then came the day his father died. The small house thick with incense, neighbors stopping by with condolences, while 12-year-old Daniel stood stiff before the framed photo, his eyes dry because there were no tears left. In that moment of grief, all he had wished for was his mother's arms around him, But she never came. Daniel rolled over, his fist clenched tight, desperate to shove the images away. But then his mother's trembling voice from the video echoed in his mind. I bought a small cake, lit the candles and sang happy birthday to you all alone. The sight of Pat crying in that dim light pierced his chest. He pressed his face into the pillow, whispering to himself, no, she doesn't deserve forgiveness. She abandoned me. Yet almost immediately another voice rose inside him, weary but unshakable. Still, she's your mother. The night dragged on with Daniel torn between fury and pity, as though his heart itself were being ripped in two. The next morning, sunlight poured golden into the kitchen. Daniel sat motionless at the table, his coffee long cold, dark circles under his eyes from a sleepless night. From the living room came Chloe's cheerful giggles as she played, her laughter bright and clear, but to Daniel, that joy only deepened the hollow ache inside. Lauren stepped closer and laid a gentle hand on his shoulder. You didn't sleep at all, did you? Daniel didn't answer, only gave a faint nod, his gaze fixed on some invisible memory far away. She sat across from him, her voice calm but steady. You should see her. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, sharp with irony. For what? To hear more late apologies? To let her scrub her conscience clean? Lauren shook her head, her eyes soft yet unwavering. Not for her. For you. You've carried that anger for 30 years. It hasn't gone away, it's been eating you alive. You think you're strong, but inside you're still that boy, waiting by the window for his mom to come home. It's time to face it, Daniel. His hand trembled as he tightened his grip on the mug. Her words sliced through the armor he had built around himself for decades. For a long moment he stayed silent, breathing heavily, weariness and resolve flickering in his eyes. Finally, his voice broke low and rough. Fine once. Just once. Lauren reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing gently. In her eyes shone a quiet hope that even if painful, this meeting might be the first step toward healing. Saturday afternoon, the quiet suburb lay still as Daniel pulled his car to a stop in front of a small pale blue house. His grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles whitened, his heart pounding as though it might burst free from his chest. More than once he nearly turned the car around, but Lauren's words echoed in his mind. Not for her. For you. He stepped out, each stride toward the porch heavy as stone. Finally he raised his hand and knocked. Inside, Pat startled. She had just taken her heart medicine and was resting in her chair when the sound came. Her frail legs carried her slowly to the door. When it creaked open, 30 years collapsed into a single moment as their eyes met. Daniel froze. The woman before him was not the image from the video but someone smaller, older, her thin frame trembling as she clutched the door frame, tears glistening in her clouded eyes. Danny, she whispered, her voice barely more than air. The name struck him like a blow. For decades he had forbidden anyone to call him that. He drew in a sharp breath, his voice hard, edged with fire. Why? He paused, his eyes burning. Just answer me this, why did you leave me? Pat shook uncontrollably. Every excuse she had rehearsed for years dissolved. Wringing her hands, she steadied herself. Because I was weak, she said, tears streaming down. I was blind, thinking chasing love would bring happiness. But I was wrong. I left you, I left your father, and from that day until now, I've lived with nothing but guilt. Daniel bit down hard, his fist trembling. Rage pressed against his throat, begging to erupt, to unleash 30 years of buried pain. But when he looked into those dim, tearful eyes, all he saw was the broken shadow of the woman who had brought him into this world. I know, Pat went on, her voice breaking. An apology can't erase your lost childhood. But I beg you, let me say this. So you'll know you never left my heart, even though I betrayed you. Silence filled the small room, broken only by the ticking clock. Daniel turned away, drawing in a deep, shuddering breath as he fought the tears burning his eyes. You took everything, he rasped. My childhood, my father, my trust. How could you ever expect forgiveness? Pat sagged, her frail shoulders shaking. Tears fell as she whispered. I don't dare expect it. I only hope you know the truth, and let me see you, even if it's only this once. Daniel looked back at her, his eyes a storm of conflict. There was no forgiveness yet, only the raw wound of old pain ripped open, leaving both mother and son in tears. The air in the room grew so heavy it felt impossible to breathe. Daniel stood in the middle of the living room, fists clenched, his voice breaking into a raw cry. Dad died, and I had to stand at his funeral alone, surrounded by strangers. I was 7 years old, fighting the world by myself. Where were you? His words cracked like thunder. Veins strained across his forehead, his eyes red and wet with fury and despair. Memories he had fought to bury surged back, leaving him trembling, yet he couldn't stop himself from shouting. Pat staggered back half a step, clutching the arm of the chair, her face contorted in anguish. Tears streamed down as her voice broke apart. I know. I died in your heart a long time ago. But I kept on living, only to wait for the day I'd hear you call me Mom again. Just once. Before I closed my eyes. Her words faltered, frail and thin, each one wrung from the last scraps of strength in her body. Daniel froze, chest heaving, lips parted but no sound coming. He turned away, covering his eyes with one hand. The fire of anger still burned, but it collided with another kind of pain, the agony of seeing his mother, guilty as she was, trembling before him, begging for the smallest thread of hope. In the tiny room, the ticking clock sounded like hammer strikes. Daniel bit down hard, his throat choked, torn between leaving forever or staying just a little longer. Daniel drew a sharp breath, turning his back on his mother as he strode toward the door. His shoulders were rigid, as if staying even one more second would drown him in rage. Just then the front door opened behind him. Lauren stepped in, holding Chloe's hand. She had been quietly waiting on the porch, listening, but when she saw Daniel about to walk away, she knew that if she didn't act now, this family would shatter all over again. Chloe darted forward, her wide eyes scanning the room until they landed on Pat. She stopped, looked up, and in a clear, innocent voice asked, "Grandma." The room froze. Daniel halted, his heart seized in his chest. Pat staggered, then collapsed to her knees. Tears spilled as her frail arms opened wide, trembling. Chloe knew nothing of the past mistakes, she only saw her grandmother. "Grandma, I'm Chloe," she whispered, wrapping her little arms around Pat. A sob tore from Pat's chest as she clutched her granddaughter, her thin shoulders shaking with years of buried grief finally breaking free. Lauren stood behind, quietly watching, her eyes shining with the conviction that where adults faltered, a child's innocence could open the door. Daniel turned back. His gaze fell on the scene, and tears slipped down his cheeks unbidden. The fury, the wounds, the years of silence, all of it seemed to dissolve, leaving only an aching hollow. And within that hollow, the faint ember of a bond between mother and child still glowed, fragile yet unextinguished. In the days following that tearful reunion, the atmosphere within the Miller family began to shift. Daniel never said outright that he forgave his mother, nor did he make any promises, but the silence between them grew less tense. And then, over the weekend, he agreed to bring Chloe to visit. Pat's hands trembled as she opened the door to see Daniel and Lauren leading their daughter inside. She had prepared a small table with a few old picture books borrowed from the library, and a puzzle set bought from a discount store. Simple as it was, everything had been arranged with the care of someone awaiting the most important guest of her life. Chloe squealed with delight at the colorful pieces. "Grandma, I want to build a castle." Pat laughed, a fragile but radiant smile breaking across her face. She sat down on the floor beside her granddaughter, helping her piece together the blocks. Every burst of laughter from the little girl made Pat's tired eyes shimmer with tears. At lunch, Pat pulled a small cake from the fridge, clumsily sliced it, and set a piece before Chloe. Then she opened a picture book and began reading aloud the fairy tales she had once promised to share with Daniel but never had. Her voice trembled, catching in places, yet Chloe listened intently, her knees resting against her grandmother's lap. From the doorway, Daniel stood silently, hands buried in his pockets. He took in the sight, his aging mother with her tangled silver hair and tear-filled eyes, his little girl nestled in her lap chattering away. His chest tightened. For so many years, he had never allowed himself to imagine this picture, never believed it could exist. Lauren stepped quietly to his side, slipping her hand into his. Daniel drew a long breath, his eyes softening. He didn't smile, but the anger had ebbed, replaced by a quiet sorrow laced with the faintest trace of hope. Time passed and Pat's health continued to decline. The chest pains came more often now, forcing her to rely on her medication nearly every day. Yet in her weary eyes a new light had begun to glow. Each night she sat at the small wooden desk, opening her journal to add a few trembling lines. Some evenings it was only a few words. "Thank you for coming back." Other times she managed more. "Your little girl is wonderful. She calls me Grandma. I thought I would never hear that again." One autumn afternoon, the air crisp and cool, red maple leaves scattered across the yard. Daniel drove up with Lauren and Chloe. The car stopped before the small house, once a place he had tried to erase from memory. But today he stepped out not with fury, but with quiet acceptance. On the porch, Pat sat in her old wooden chair, her silver hair tousled by the breeze. Chloe ran straight to her, wrapping tiny arms around her waist, chattering about school before resting her head in her grandmother's lap as if she had found a safe haven. Pat cradled her close, a fragile, radiant smile lighting her deeply lined face. Lauren settled on the porch steps, listening to their laughter, her heart easing. She knew these days, however few, were a gift Pat had never imagined she would be granted after all those years. Daniel lingered by the porch, hands in his pockets, his gaze shifting from his mother to his daughter. The sight of 3 generations bound together tightened something deep within him. He didn't speak, only gave a small nod. Simple, but it carried everything. Recognition, acceptance, permission for her to step back into his life, however belated. Pat lifted her eyes, meeting her son's. She said nothing, but the tear glistening in her lashes was answer enough. Her shoulders loosened, as though at last she had laid down the burden she had carried for 30 years. Chloe looked up, innocently taking both their hands and tugging them closer. In that moment, no formal words of forgiveness were needed. Family still flowed between them, an unseen thread binding what had once been torn apart. Better late than never. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it opens the door to love. The story of Pat and Daniel is a powerful reminder that time never turns back, yet regret and love always remain in the human heart. For 30 years, Pat lived with the torment of abandoning her family, and in the end, all she longed for was one chance to see her son and granddaughter before her final breath. It shows us that none of us is perfect, but the courage to face our mistakes and speak the words "I'm sorry" can open a new door, even if it comes late. For Daniel, anger had taken root in his heart throughout his childhood, but when he faced the truth and saw the love that still lingered from his mother, he realized that forgiveness is not about forgetting, it's about freeing yourself from the weight of the past. This story reminds us, don't wait until it's too late to express your love. Cherish your family while you still can, because family bonds, even when broken, are still the strongest ties we have. What do you think about this story? If it touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more meaningful stories.